Hi, I'm Carl Sweeney.
And I'm Raquel Stecher, and this is the CineHistorians podcast, where we explore the history of cinema from across the globe.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the CineHistorians podcast. As ever, we are your co-hosts, Carl Sweeney and Raquel Stecher, and we are here for episode 6 of our second season. We're still going through the Sight and Sound Top 100, or at least selected movies on that list, the list from 2022, the greatest films of all time. And we've arrived, Raquel, at a very interesting one, I think, haven't we? We're traveling back to the 1970s today.
Yeah, we're going to a part of the world we haven't explored yet.
Yeah, indeed, which is very exciting. The film is called Touki Bouki. And I'll just throw it over to you, Raquel, for some background on, like you say, this is a part of the world we haven't explored yet. This is a movie from Senegal. So do you want to tell us a bit more about Senegalese cinema?
Yes, so we have Touki Bouki, directed by Djibril Diop Mambéty. And I just kind of wanted to give a little overview about the history of the cinema of Senegal. So now Senegal was a French colony until it proclaimed its independence in 1960. And prior to that, Senegal and other French African colonies were under a law called the Laval Decree, which stated that anyone who wanted to make a motion picture or a sound recording of any kind had to get approval from the lieutenant governor of that colony. And this was a form of censorship in order to prevent anti-colonialist messaging from being spread. So we actually don't see any Senegalese cinema until 1955, when documentary filmmaker Pauline Soumanou Vieira made a documentary called Africa on the Seine in 1955. It's considered not only the first Senegalese film, but it's also the first Francophone film from Africa. And he worked through the 50s, but it isn't until after Senegal's independence in 1960 do we see a film industry born, because there's a lot more freedom to make film with any kind of messaging. So the late 1960s and the 1970s, it ended up being like a golden age in Senegalese cinema. Filmmakers could get access to funding, and there was an increased interest in the arts and culture and a desire to support Senegalese culture and identity. The most prominent filmmakers working around this time were Ousmane Sembène, who made a lot of great films, including Black Girl from 1966, which is also on the Sight and Sound list, as well as Shala from 1975 and Sedo from 1977. And during this time, you also get Senegalese filmmaker Djibril Diop Mambéty, who we're talking about today. So a little background on him. He was born and raised in Senegal. He first started out in theater, where he studied and worked as an actor. He was expelled from the National Theater and quickly turned his focus to filmmaking. He started raising money right away. And even though he had no formal training in filmmaking, he had a vision and the discipline to just pursue his dream. In 1969, still in his early 20s, Mambéty directed and produced the short film Contrast City, which contrasts the French-style architecture of Dakar with the homes and businesses of everyday people. And this becomes a theme in his other films, The Contrasts. A year later, he released another short called Badu Boy. And his first film, feature film, was Touki Bouki, the film we're talking about today. And it's widely considered to be his masterpiece. And Mambéty offered a fresh perspective on filmmaking and storytelling. His films included themes of like youth, independence, anti-colonialism, disillusionment, class, and inequality. And they also have this focus on the individual and how they fit in their greater community. And Mambéty was a teenager when Senegal gained its independence from France. So this transitional period had a huge impact on him. And you kind of see that in his films, especially with characters who are in transition or feeling the effects of great contrast or opposing conflicts. And after Touki Bouki, Mambéty kind of disappeared. He didn't make another feature-length film until the 1990s. He made one film in 1989, a short called Parlons Grand-Mère, but we're not exactly sure why he dropped up. It could have been funding reasons, because the 1980s in particular was a tough time for Senegalese filmmakers because there were cuts to government funding, especially to the arts. But it could have also been for political reasons. So in 1992, Mambéty made his next feature film, hyenas. And unfortunately, Mambéty passed away in 1998 at 53. He only made a total of 7 films, including 2 more short films after Hyena, Le Franc in 1994 and The Little Girl Who Sold the Sun, released posthumously in 1999. But we have these treasures, including Touki Bouki.
Yeah, thanks, Raquel. So I'll give the customary spoiler warning for the movie. If anybody wants to enjoy this film in the best possible way, I think pause our episode, watch the movie, come back to us. I'll also just give a slight content warning that if you struggle with scenes of animals dying, then this movie has that in quite graphic detail. So just be aware of that. And actually, we will talk about that a bit later in the episode. The story of Touki Bouki focuses on 2 young lovers, and their names are Mori and Anta. Mori is played by an actor called Magaye Niang, and Anta, played by an actress, Mareme Niang, the same surname, no relation. Now, Mori is a guy, he drives around a young man driving around a motorcycle. It's one of the most memorable visual elements of the film, actually. He has the skull of a zebu, which is a type of cattle, atop the handlebars. He's got this cross that the motorcycle also carries around, which is a fertility symbol. It's difficult to forget the motorbike, I think, once you've seen the movie. Anta is a student at the local university. Both of them seem quite disenchanted with their surroundings and their prospects, and they decide that what they should do is raise the money to travel to Paris. And to do this, they carry out several criminal schemes, including trying to steal the profits from a wrestling event. And they're unsuccessful until Mori successfully steals from an acquaintance called Charlie. So they end up with the means to board this ship to Paris, but will they? Well, more on that point later, I think. We're going to discuss that later in the episode. Quite a short description, Raquel, and the film itself, though, is more complex than that indicates. Right. And I'm sure we'll get onto that as we discuss it. Do you want to fill us in on some of the background on this movie?
Yes, I'll try my best because there's actually not too much about the production of Touki Bouki. So it was written, produced, and directed by Djibril Diop Mambéty, and he was influenced by the techniques of French New Wave filmmakers. We talk about the French New Wave in the first season of this podcast. And Touki Bouki shows us Mambéty's style of social realism with a touch of whimsy. And as I said, there isn't much information about the production. We do know that it's made on a small budget with some government funding from Senegal and none from France, because even though the Laval decree had ended, France still had the France's Bureau du Cinema had certain rules for filmmakers who wanted funding from them, and they had certain standards. So Mambéty had a lot of freedom because his funding did not come from France, only from Senegal and other sources. So Touki Bouki premiered at the Cannes Film Festival as part of their Director's Fortnight selection. It didn't get released in the United States until the 1990s and more globally until the mid-2000s. And it was Martin Scorsese and his World Cinema Project that helped fund a restoration of the film in 2008. And because of that, it's become more accessible and its legacy has grown, and we'll talk more about that later. And we know that accessibility helps in getting recognition. And just to talk a little bit about Touki Bouki's history on the Sight and Sound list, it made its first appearance on the list in 2012, where it was tied for the 93rd spot. And then the most recent list from 2022, which we're talking about in this season, it moves up to number 66. It's one of 3 films from the continent of Africa to make it on the list. The second is Black Girl, which I talked about earlier for the 95th spot. The third film is The Battle of Algiers from 1965, which is an Italian-Algerian production, so you can count it for both continents, but it was mostly shot in Algeria, and that appears on the 45th spot. And I just kind of wanted to break down how the different continents are represented on the list. There is a bit of overlap where you have co-productions or you have some discussions about whether something belongs to one continent or another. Mm-hmm. So there's a little overlap. My numbers might not be what your numbers end up being if you do the same breakdown. So like I said, Africa has 3 films. Next, for Asia, there are 21 films. In Australia, we just have the one film, The Piano from 1992. Europe is the most represented on the list with 46 films. North America is second with 35, all of them from the United States. And South America has nothing, unfortunately. And if you want to throw Antarctica in there too, there's also nothing from there.
Is that fairly unsurprising in a way? Because we've talked before about how the list, they opened up the list for 2022, but still, there are different ways to look at it. But like you say, a list that prioritizes European cinema and Hollywood.
Right.
I suppose we would expect that, and not necessarily that's what we want it to be like, but it's not surprising. What do you think?
I agree. Even also the representation of Asia in there, because there's so many wonderful films from Japan or Hong Kong. So there's been a lot of appreciation for those regions of the world and the cinema that they have put out there. But the accessibility too
Yeah,
for those films has been greater, and we see now more accessibility from films from other places, especially when you have something like a Touki Bouki made more available more widely. Then you have this appreciation grow, so things are shifting, but then we have this history of really appreciating, and also those industries just put out more films too.
yeah, and it's quite a deep-rooted thing, right? So, yeah, progress like towards a more inclusive canon of cinema is happening, but is slow sometimes.
Yeah.
So, with Touki Bouki, then to moving on to a more general discussion, I suppose my first question to you, Raquel, is why did you choose this film? Why were you drawn to this one?
Well, I was really taken with it. I watched it for the first time earlier this year, and I really got into Senegalese cinema. I was watching so many movies, and I was trying to pick between Black Girl or Touki Bouki, and I just ended up picking Touki Bouki because Black Girl's theme was a little closer to Jeanne Dielman, with the story of
Yeah,
like
yeah.
feminism and then also domesticity. And I thought this would be an interesting one to analyze, and also just to throw something in there that maybe people hadn't heard of, and maybe want to try.
Well, I think it was a very strong choice. I hadn't seen the film before. I think I tried to locate it maybe even after the 2012 list and found it hard to find this movie again after 2022. This gave me the impetus to finally watch the film. So I'm very glad you did choose it. It's fascinating to read about it not being popular with the public in Senegal upon original
Mm.
release. And even Senegalese critics. According to one source I looked at, the film was taken out of cinemas after even possibly just a few days. I wonder how much of that is because it's so very different to a lot of other films of that time. And a lot of people have talked about how actually the editing is really distinctive here. The sound, the sound design is as well. The narrative, in a way, is kind of straightforward, but in other ways, it's sometimes hard. Well, that's my question, I suppose. On a first watch, do you think many viewers might be a little confused by this movie in some ways, and it takes a while to acclimatize to? Or do you not feel that? Do you think that it's easy to kind of grasp straight off the bat?
I mean, I can understand the pushback because it's actually considered like the first or one of the first art house films from Africa. So maybe there was this understanding of film being a lot more traditional, not necessarily having all these multi-layered themes and all this messaging within visuals. And maybe it was a little easier to digest. And this one is very much artistic, but also it shows what life there is at that time. And sometimes that could be a bit shocking too, just to see yourself or to see where you're from presented back to you, even if though it's not presented in a bad way. It's just presented. I mean, this is a very interesting time in the history of Senegal because they're going through that transition of being independent but also having that colonial tie, finding their identity, but then also kind of suffering from that colonialism, and then also just the vision of somewhere else being better. I mean, that's all kind of thematic in here. And then there's also so much to take from Touki Bouki in multiple viewings, because in the second viewing I got more of a sense of the stuff about like the voodoo, the talisman, the good luck charms, maybe that I hadn't picked up on before. Another viewing, I was focusing more on the visuals with the motorcycle, because the motorcycle is like a third character in the film. It's so important, and how it ties to Maury's journey is so important too. So I think This is a film you can't necessarily appreciate just on the first viewing. You might need to watch it more, but that is also not a fault of it either. I think it just has a lot of richness that can give you something with multiple viewings.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And like I said, I was able to give a fairly concise description of the plot because the through line of the plot is fairly straightforward. But then when you look at the way the film tells that story, the editing, like I said, that's an area where it's less predictable. We sometimes jump around in a way that isn't always clear cut. So
Yeah.
there are connections between things that aren't always spelled out really explicitly for us. So maybe an example would be we see a young boy herding cattle at the outset of the film, as I alluded to earlier, and I'll talk about it more later, but then we cut to a scene that involves an abattoir. Now, some of the commentators I was reading were sort of wondering, is the boy supposed to be a younger version of our main character? And some people seem to think it is, some people seem to think it isn't. The film isn't literal on that point. So there's a sense sometimes that the film doesn't feel like it needs to be literal with some of the connections it's drawing, which I think is actually a strength of the film because it does add a level of richness. Like I said, the central plot itself is fairly simple. If it's got quite a hectic style, and I think it does, I think it kind of fits back in with what you were saying. This is a film from a country that's in a state of transition, which itself is kind of hectic and perhaps chaotic. So therefore, if the style of the film is, maybe you could say that's appropriate, and that there's a level of disorientation that works fairly well. On the visual style of the film, Mambéty had said, "It's the way I dream. To do that, one must have a mad belief that everything is possible. You have to be mad to the point of being irresponsible." And he talks about cinema needs to be reinvented each time, and that anyone venturing into cinema has a share in its reinvention. So actually, quite a nice way of putting it. Do you agree? Do you feel like there is a dreamlike sort of quality here that he's kind of touching on? Do you see that in the film?
Yeah, I watched this documentary that's really interesting called Djibril Diop Mambéty, The Dreamer. It's on YouTube, and I'll leave a link down below. And in the beginning of it, it's Mambéty actually talking about how he comes up with his stories. He says he closes his eyes, he sees points of light, he lets his heart speak to him, and the story comes to him. And I think that speaks to that dreamlike fantasy element that you're talking about, because there's so many visuals that are telling us stuff without necessarily showing. I just think of those baobab trees, and then you hear the music of Paris in the background, which I'll talk more about later. Those are the structures, that the natural structures you see in like a rural area of Senegal, and then you hear the music about this very different place with very different structures somewhere else, but you don't see it. So it's that combination of visuals that says so much, and it is that dream part of it too, because they're dreaming of going to Paris, living another life, but you don't see Paris. It's just spoken. We don't really see visuals of where they're going to. We just hear their imagination of what life could be like there, and we also see contrast. Like there's that big sign that says Nice, Corsica, and another place, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
you get a shot of like a shanty town with like piles of beautiful, like colorful clothes in the middle. So you see like this contrast, like there's this place far away that's presented to them. And then there's also that great interaction with the lady selling vegetables, like the vendor, and she's having a conversation
Yes.
with a woman. She's talking about how her son moved to France. He's never written to her. He hasn't come back. And the customer she's interacting with says nothing good ever comes from France. So it's just this really, I think the dream quality is that there is this far away place. We don't see it. We just hear it. We just hear an interpretation of it.
Yeah, and also there's a critic, Amy Taubin, who saw the film in the late 80s and kind of took the dreamlike interpretation a bit further and said the couple's escape attempt might have happened, or it might have been imagined by the man, the woman, or both, as they lay dreaming in the sun. And thinking back on it, there are multiple
Oh,
shots of them looking that when they're sat by the motorbike and I think she's led with her head on him. So we see that shot a couple of times, which might support that interpretation. I suppose going back to the earlier point that the film has this quite distinctive visual style. The film doesn't always want to lay everything out for you. So it kind of
yeah.
creates the space to read it that way if you would like to. As Raquel's kind of touched on, the approach to sound is very distinctive too. And there's a nice story about how that might have sprung from Mambéty's own sort of life experience, because As a child, he would apparently go to his local open air cinema, but couldn't always afford to actually go in, so would sometimes stand outside and listen to the movies, and therefore picked up this sense that sound actually is very important. And that certainly is the case in this film, isn't it? I know you're going to talk about some aspects of that later, but just the mix of different sounds, like, like lots of stuff being thrown into a blender is kind of how I would describe it, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
quite
no,
remarkable.
I agree. And he had talked about how because he got those little glimpses of cinema, but not in the cinema, but like maybe outside the cinema, that he stole cinema. Like he didn't have the formal training. He didn't even technically have a formal like exposure to film. He just kind of steals it for himself and creates his own vision of it and his own style. And yeah, the use of sound is really interesting between the music in the background, some other sounds, maybe it's like a speaker or it's the water crashing over the rocks or things like that. It's just interesting use of sound. And I love also, just to jump on that, the way he shows us the people of Dakar and the surrounding communities. We get all these really great shots of people at work and at play, like vendors selling goods, people transporting water, people playing or observing a card game. There's even a segment where they show the national sport of Senegal, lamb, which is a very specific style of wrestling to that
Yeah.
country. We see like workers directing traffic. We even see a memorial procession for General de Gaulle, who had died like a few years before. And every shot in here is a painting. There's so many beautiful shots of, the motorcycle or them dressed to the nines in the procession, or just Anta going onto the boat and him trying to figure out if he wants to go on the boat.
Just as a very quick aside, two films in a row that we've covered then where Charles de Gaulle is a factor, which is an unusual coincidence I didn't anticipate. Kind of happened to us in season one when we had the actor who plays the mayor in Jaws was also in The Graduate, wasn't he? So that's our equivalent
Yes.
this year.
We did a double bill with him.
So kind of as we've touched on, so like a big theme of the film is this sense of disenchantment during this post-independence period. And you could argue that although that's about, this historical moment in time, the 1970s, but a lot of those factors are still quite relevant today, in terms of the allure of emigration, the fact that can actually be quite risky, disillusionment with the governing class, and that sort of thing. One of the strengths of this film, I think, is that the film kind of pitches itself at an interesting point between different impulses. So it doesn't necessarily convey a sense that moving to France would be exactly the right choice for these characters. If they stay at home, they'll likely be living a life of poverty. But if they go, that brings with it all sorts of different kinds of challenges too. So yeah, it doesn't seem to think that one choice or the other is exactly, perfection. It has this kind of wavering tendency. And I think part of going back to what I was saying, the soundtrack kind of plays into that a little bit because it's blending lots of disparate things too.
France is romanticized, and if they go there, it'll be different, but it won't be what they expect. So we never get the sense that they're escaping to somewhere great. We just get the sense that they might not know exactly what they're heading for, but there are also some expectations too that there might be issues there, like we get with that conversation about nothing good comes from France.
Yeah, and also there's something interesting about the way that the song that we hear again and again is presented, which I'll leave for now because I know you wanted to talk about the Josephine Baker
Yes.
song later. We'll come back to that maybe. As you said, very interesting that you can compare this film to things like the French New Wave. I suppose one of the big similarities is that this would be a film where there are constraints that the filmmaker is facing, and actually sometimes the constraints are what become a virtue, and that is reminiscent of when we talked about the likes of Godard and Truffaut. And okay, they couldn't hire out an expensive studio, they couldn't afford that much film stock, but actually then that gives their films more of a spontaneous quality. And I think something like that is going on here too.
That actually reminded me of French cinema. Like there was a shot that looked exactly like, it was this woman on a chair just sunning herself, and it looked exactly like Alain Delon in Purple Noon, sitting on a chair sunning himself. And there was like shots that reminded me of Godard's Pure Le Fou, especially with like the color palette and some interesting shots. So you could see some influence from French cinema, but it also just feels so so unique to Mambéty's vision too. It just stands out so differently and it's visually very stunning. And I also really like how this shows so many contrasts between, there's Senegal we see and France we hear of. There's the Wolof language and the French language, and sometimes that's hard to pick up. But if you know some French, you can tell when they're switching between the languages. That's really interesting. It's rural versus urban, and it gives you that sense of transition. Like there's these two different realities that are existing, and also, somebody likened this to Bonnie and Clyde. It's like a couple going on a crime spree, obviously not as violent or as intense as that story, but I think that's also really interesting. They're in this relationship, they have this sort of goal, and they sort of become celebrities in the procession. Everyone considers them like, oh, look, they're so well dressed. They're in this car waving to everybody. They must be somebody of note. And it kind of mirrors like that Bonnie and Clyde of them being so infamous too and famous in their
Yeah.
lifetime. So I think it's an
Yeah.
interesting comparison.
Yeah, and also to go back to the point about Mambéty, and like you're saying, shots in the film that remind you of certain French films or whatnot. It's interesting because I saw one quote from him where he said, actually, the impulse for what he wanted to do, it was more about the historical moment than trends in European cinema. But at the same time, he was at one point the secretary of the Dakar Cine Club. So I just think it'd be really fascinating if we could know exactly what films he had seen
Yeah.
and when he saw them. To go back to the point about accessibility, and you sort of charted that with the history of this film on the Sight and Sound list and so on, and the fact that it got a restoration from Scorsese's foundation and blah blah blah. It definitely does seem to have developed a bit more of a cultural standing in recent years, doesn't it? And
Yes.
I'll just mention quickly one example that I thought was particularly interesting, which actually some listeners, even if you don't know the movie, you may have got wind that Jay-Z and Beyonce used an image that evokes this film when they were doing a world tour a few years ago in their promotional campaign. So it's of Jay-Z behind the handles of a motorbike. It has the skull of a zebu kind of adorning it. Beyonce's the passenger. So very clearly evoking Touki Bouki. Now, a woman called Mati Diop, who's Mambéty's niece, who's going to be talked about a bit later in the episode, she felt a bit uneasy about the way they referenced the film because she sort of felt that they didn't really care about what the artistic or political intent was behind the movie, and that they'd kind of invoked it in quite a light-hearted way. She did also go on to say at a later date, well, I still like listening to Beyonce. She wasn't that offended. But it's just kind of an example of the way movies get kind of remixed these days, right? We have such a postmodern culture that, kind of an iconic image can just kind of get harnessed for their world tour. Or we see it all the time with GIFs or memes, don't we? That
Right.
iconic scenes just become fodder for humor. I wonder what Mambéty himself would have thought about that, because he was kind of open to the idea of cross-cultural pollination, because he adapted a Swiss-German play for his film Hyenas. The play was called The Visit.
Yes.
And he talked about, well, films are kind of a meeting, there's giving and receiving. So I can't know this for sure, but I suspect he wouldn't have had as much of a problem necessarily with what Jay-Z and Beyonce did. Does what they did actually help, though? Because it makes the film more widely known to a broader audience, even if it's done in kind of a cursory, way that you might say doesn't actually take into account the context. But at least it gets people talking about the movie. I don't know. What do you think?
I think I lean more on it's a good thing because people like Beyonce or Jay-Z have such a huge platform, and if they reference something like that, it just adds more awareness of the movie. Maybe it'll encourage people to watch it. And I always think that's a good thing. And I think those references in pop culture tend to be lighthearted
Yeah.
anyway. So even if they referenced another movie, it might have been in a lighthearted way that I don't necessarily think it needs the political messaging, but the fact that there's like an acknowledgement of this work of art from somewhere else and kind of referencing it in another form of art, I think is always beneficial in my mind.
I think that's a very fair way to put it. Okay, Raquel, anything else you wanted to talk about with this movie in a general sense before we take a break and then come back for some key moments?
No, I'm ready to dive into those scenes.
Okay, we'll be back very shortly then, listeners, with, like I say, key moments and any other business. Okay, everybody, welcome back to CineHistorians. We are still here discussing Touki Bouki as part of our season on the 2022 Sight and Sound list of the greatest films of all time, as voted for by film critics. Okay, key moments for Touki Bouki, Raquel. We've got some very interesting ones, I think.
Yes.
Where do you want to start?
So I wanted to start with a sequence that happens. It's 11 minutes. It happens starting at the 14-minute point to the 25th minute point, and it is Maury's kidnapping by university students. And there's the sequence with the goat, and it leaves us to the beach sequence that you had mentioned earlier. So it's kind of hard to just like name it as one thing, but how it progresses is really interesting. So we have Maury, who gets around on his very distinctive bicycle, and like you had mentioned, it's adorned with the skull and horns, and it's got that frame with the fertility symbol. And like I had mentioned, it's almost like a third character in the film because it's such an integral part of the story from beginning to end. What happened, like how Maury travels on the motorcycle, but also what happens to the motorcycle and what that represents. It's really interesting. So in this particular sequence, Maury rides his bicycle to a university to pick up his girlfriend Anta, who is studying there. And when he gets there, he's confronted by a group of male students who all gang up on him. And this is where like Mambéty is really good with like contrast, because you get contrast from the very beginning. You know, Maury is mostly speaking in Wolof, and these university students are speaking in French. Maury's in his normal clothes. They're all, you know, well dressed, and they have this like sort of pompous attitude. And there's like this power dynamic that emerges because it's like many against one. It's like rich versus poor. It's French, colonial French versus native Wolof. So that's really interesting. And so the university students like tie up Maury with a lasso like he was cattle. It's really dehumanizing. They tie him to the back of their Jeep, and like we see them drive off with him, and he's hanging off the back of the Jeep, and he's roped with a lasso, and the skull and horns are like tied to him. So it's almost like he's an animal that they captured and they're showing off. It's really just kind of a horrifying shot, but it also speaks to how he is feeling like he is being treated there, and maybe his vision of going somewhere else where he could be treated better. And the sequence is interesting because it's intercut with these scenes of a goat being slaughtered. And we see also shots of Anta being there. We see her undress. And at first it seems like she's undressing in front of this scene of the slaughter, but we actually learned that she's actually undressing in front of Maury, but we don't know that yet. So there's this correlation between the way Maury is being treated and how the goat is being treated, and it hints at this like larger theme of colonialism and abuse and dehumanization. More intercuts in the sequence, you see shots of the ocean, mostly of ocean waves crashing on a rocky seashore. And to me, this like very much symbolizes like this faraway land beckoning them to escape their current situation. There's like a new life elsewhere. Then the sequence also shows Anta's hand gripping onto that frame that is that fertility symbol, and we hear her moaning and gripping onto that frame. And then we learn, oh, they were just making love, and she was actually undressing in front of him earlier, and that Maury has survived this attack. And then they talk about leaving and going elsewhere, and Anta's like, you have a lot of debt. What are you gonna do? And then that's when they sort of go on their crime spree. I use that very lightly because it doesn't even feel like a crime spree. They're just trying to get money in order to get onto that boat. And I think what Mambéty does really good with the sequence is it shows us the horrors of colonialism in terms of like how it relegates certain people as less than, Maury being dehumanized so horribly in that scene. And then you see Maury pondering life in France. He talks about like, and I'll talk about this a little more later in the next section. It's like, they'll have to call me Mr. Maury. They'll have to treat me better. Yeah. And when people leave for France, they don't come back. Nothing good comes from France. So we kind of get the sense that he wants something different, but maybe there isn't something there waiting for him either. So it sets off the story really nicely of their adventure, but it also gives you a lot to think about what's actually happening to this character.
Yeah, I think that's a great description. And I think I like the way that you teased out some of the possible points of comparison maybe between the character of Maury and the animals, and the way he's transported by those students maybe is like he's, being herded. Like, yeah, very interesting. And actually, I'll try and tie that into a discussion of, well, you've mentioned the scene of involving the goat. So I'll focus more on the scene at the outset of the movie involving the abattoir. So as I was saying earlier, we see the young boy herding cattle, and then very quickly the film cuts to the abattoir where the zebu is slaughtered. And it's a scene that tends to be read as a kind of symbol. And there are different ways to maybe look at that. That the animal we see is kind of a stand-in for this idea of African countries who are struggling to escape the clutches of their butchers, aka the colonizers. So I've definitely seen that interpretation of it. Some people really focus on the juxtaposition because we go from this more natural setting to this very industrial process of slaughter. And then therefore you can read the abattoir as a symbol of modernity. Again, to go back to the motorcycle, which the more I think about it, the more I think the motorcycle is the most interesting aspect of the film in some ways. That the motorcycle kind of blends the two because it's a symbol of the modern world. It's a modern vehicle. And then because it's got those horns adorning it, it's also a symbol of nature. So it sort of plays into that idea of an overlap between the past and the present, which I think is an important idea in the film more broadly.
That's a good point.
So yeah, the more I think about it, there's lots to sort of be discussed there with the motorbike. With the abattoir, so I'll just give you a quote, Raquel, from a critic called Ashley Clark, who said that the sequence is necessary as a symbolic harbinger and strictly not for the faint of heart. I would suspect we could definitely agree on the latter part of that. But it really isn't for the faint of heart. Like I said earlier, if you don't want to see this kind of thing, it's tough to watch. You may want to skip ahead slightly in the movie, or I think some people would want to avoid the film, would get a couple of minutes in and turn it off, perhaps.
I fast forward through it because I've already seen it, so I don't necessarily need to re-experience it.
I'm just kind of wondering how we think about this. But I suppose you have to be mindful of different cultural attitudes to this sort of thing. I would like to know much more about the making of the film, and I think, like you said earlier, it's kind of hard to find a lot of detail about that. I wonder if there are other ways, like if you want to have this as some kind of a symbol, this isn't necessarily the only way to do it. It could have been done a bit more suggestively. We could have just seen some of the blood, for example. I want to know more about how they were filmed, because is it a kind of documentary type thing going on where what we're seeing is something that's happening in an actual abattoir, in which case maybe you can, be a bit more lenient with this. I think where I'd have a real problem with it is if we're seeing animals being killed for the film that otherwise would not have been killed. That I think is tough to take. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'd like to believe that it's, just a real abattoir, and because you go into the history of Mambéty's films, he has a lot of shots of people at work and play. So this to me is a situation where he films people at work at this abattoir. It does seem like there's too much of it, almost like we would get the hint of it and not see that much, or maybe it could be more subtle. It is very in your face. It's very shocking. And then the first slaughter scene comes at the very beginning of the movie. So it's a lot to take, but maybe it was his intent to really drive the message that here's a very graphic visual of this group of people taking domain over these animals. Now they control them, as a greater symbol of, in this world, there is a group of people taking dominion over other people. And there's this power dynamic, and you can really shock the audience into that messaging with that kind of scene. But also for me, it just is very hard to watch. And when I first saw it, I was like, do I want to continue? How much of this is in this movie? And there is a bit, there's, I think, maybe 3 or 4 different scenes. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough to watch.
It is tough. It definitely feels like it could very well be, this is a depiction of something that's happening in an actual abattoir. So I would love if anybody has solid information on that, I would love to know. I think it does become very crucial. This abattoir scene comes back into play at the end of the movie when we get some very interesting intercutting. So I'm going to return to this when I get to my next key moment, because I do think the critics who say this is an important aspect of the film are right, that the choice to include this was made. It isn't just done to shock. I think there's a wider point being made, even if it's, some of the interpretation is slightly different on what that point is, basically. I'll try and come back to that, like I say. shortly. How about you give us your next key moment then, Raquel, at this point?
So this is another sequence, which I'll just call the trunk sequence because I don't know how to name it. So this is where Maury and Anta have stolen one of two trunks, hoping that the trunk will have some money in it and things that they could use in order to continue on with their adventure. Maury is traveling on a motorcycle and Anta is following him in a taxi cab, and the trunk is strapped to the back. And there's many shots of the trunk in the foreground, and you kind of get like a bit of Dakar in the remainder of the frame, and then it cuts to other shots. Maury on the motorcycle with his head obscured in a bright red scarf, which is a very visually interesting image. Throughout that sequence, we hear an interior monologue of Maury talking about like and imagining a life in France. He says, "Anyone who treads on my toes will be sorry. I'll move in the right circles," and he talks about gaining some respect when he's there that he isn't able to get, especially after that terrible kidnapping scene, which is obviously a sign of great disrespect. In this monologue, he talks about visiting the Arc de Triomphe, the Eiffel Tower, Champs-Élysées, Notre Dame. And then when he's talking about this, we see those images of the baobab trees, which are the nice contrast between like, okay, these are the natural structures in his world, in this rural landscape. And these are the spoken words of historical architecture in a far off place that we don't see. And I think that contrast is really interesting. And what interests me most about this sequence in particular is the fact that it's Josephine Baker singing Paris, Paris, Paris in the background. And it appears several times in the film, but it's really important in this scene in particular. It plays the chorus. The chorus that stands out the most is like when she talks about Paris being a corner of paradise. I think it's "C'est sur la terre un coin de paradis," and it's this idea of Paris being this like wonderful place, and it echoes Maury's mindset about like how he's romanticizing Paris. But I think it's also very interesting that Josephine Baker is chosen for this. Josephine Baker was a singer, dancer, actress, and she became a great icon of the jazz age. And she was born in the United States and started her career there, but she faced all sorts of challenges in her career because of like racism, segregation. There's rules and regulations of what could and could not be shown on film. And there's only so much she could do with her career. So she famously fled to Paris because she knew she would have more freedom, not only personal freedom, but freedom in her career. And she really thrived there. Even during World War II, she became a spy for de Gaulle, another de Gaulle reference. So to have somebody who did escape a situation that she was not happy with to go to Paris to imagine another life, and that the fact that she is the one singing Paris, 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 I think is a very specific and methodical choice, and I think it works beautifully, especially if you know the history of Josephine Baker.
I was very struck by the use of the song because it sort of sounds like what we're hearing is a fragment that then skips back every few seconds, right? And we keep hearing the same extract again and again and again. So yes, it kind of maybe plays into the idea that, okay, here's a song that is offering us the promise of Paris, but actually this the promise of this journey is not going to be fulfilled. And the song kind of skipping back in time, skipping back to the earlier place is kind of suggestive of that, maybe. But
yeah, it's a good point.
You know, almost like a sense of, I don't know, it gives us a sense of things not being resolved, which is very pertinent to how the film ends, maybe. So that's kind of where I'm going next. So I'm going to
nice segue.
Well, a few thoughts on the closing sequences involving the boat. So this is where I answered the end of the unfinished synopsis earlier. What happens is that Anta boards the boat and sets sail. Maury does not. One of the interesting features of that closing sequence is that there are some white characters on the boat making discriminatory comments. Again, playing into the idea that this journey to a new country isn't going to be, if you forgive the pun, plain sailing, right? Because she's likely to face attitudes such as this when she gets there. And then we get lots of, there's the editing throughout the film is very interesting, but in the final minutes, highly interesting too. So lots of intercutting. We see Anta on the boat looking kind of alienated or adrift. We see Maury running. We see some of those images again from the opening abattoir sequence that we've already talked about. So it's interesting to try and tease out what the meanings might be there. So why do these images of the slaughter come back into play? Is the implication that one or even both of these characters is like these animals who have been slaughtered? So if we look at it from her perspective, she's kind of bought into the idea that her future is going to be brighter if she leaves her home country. Like we've just said, she may be opening herself up actually to lots of different challenges if she does move. Maury, on the other hand, we can also say maybe he's the one who's met an unfortunate fate. He doesn't appear to have, he's very disillusioned with his future prospects. He seems to feel very disconsolate at the end of the film. There's a shot of him, I think several shots of him sitting on the concrete stairs looking really forlorn. So perhaps the images of the slaughter are kind of something we could tie more closely to him. Or maybe we're related to both of them. Or maybe there's some other meaning entirely which is intended. But I think my money's on the idea we're supposed to make a connection between that abattoir scene and both of these characters. The film seems to be saying to me that there's no unambiguously correct choice here. Escape if you want to escape, but it's not going to be a picnic. On the other hand, staying at home isn't going to be ideal either. So I don't know. It's a film that's quite playful in many ways, but one that I think comes to a fairly pessimistic conclusion. Do you see it as a pessimistic conclusion, Raquel? And I'm wondering, because I think you had said to me before I watched the movie that it's quite a sad film. And I'm wondering if it's mainly things like the ending that you might have been thinking about.
Yeah, I mean that shot, like you said, of him just sitting on like a set of stairs and he's just dejected. I think he's holding a piece of the horn that's left from his broken motorcycle, which he can't use anymore because it's been in a crash. Feels like he had this goal, he was almost there, and you see him on the I forget what it's called, the thing that goes up to the boat, and he's just holding his chin and he's wondering, should I do it? Anta's already gone on the boat, and we see all these images of her on the boat in her bright like outfit, and she's just like wondering when he's gonna show up. Like he doesn't know if he should do that. And also, what I think is interesting too is the references to Mambéty, because in that sequence before he makes that decision to not go on the boat, we hear a speaker call for Mambéty, who we learned earlier is a police detective. So Charlie, the rich man who Maury steals from, he calls the police, is asking for a police detective to help him with this robbery, and he ends up talking to Diop Mambéty, and we don't see him, but he is referenced later, so we kind of get the hint that maybe Mambéty is on to the fact that Maury is going onto the boat. Maybe he discovered that the ticket was purchased and he knows that he's going to get in trouble. So maybe if he escapes, even though he doesn't have this other life, he can get away with, because we see him trying to get away, in a couple of scenes of getting caught from stealing. So I don't know. It's just really interesting. It's interesting. It's almost like an Alfred Hitchcock appearance by the director. I mean, although this one's a little more involved, but we don't actually see the director, but we hear his name.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so again, I think I take the ending as quite a pessimistic overall conclusion, but the film as a whole, we've hopefully talked it up, and it's, if you can stomach the animal scenes, I think well worth.
And there's also playful elements too of it. There's some, especially towards the end when it gets serious. There are also some joke elements between, like, there's the argument with the guy who's directing traffic. There's this guard who's kind of fumbling, trying to prevent like this criminal on the run, trying to get through a gate, and there's like, he's making like a silly face because he doesn't want to get caught. So there is a bit of whimsy throughout the film that kind of cuts that edge of like the seriousness of a lot of the story.
Yeah, that's very well said. Okay, so we've come to the any other business segment of the episode, Raquel. We've got some film recommendations coming up, beginning with a couple of your choices, I think. Is that right?
Yes, I'm always trying to get people to watch more movies, so I love this section. So I actually wanted to talk about the two sequels to Touki Bouki. And they're not sequels in the traditional sense, but they both imagine a life after the end of Touki Bouki. So I wanted to talk about both. The first is Hyenas from 1992, which we had both mentioned earlier. In an interview, Mambéty said, "I began to make Hyenas when I realized I absolutely had to find one of the characters in Touki Bouki, and that character is Anta." So he wanted a story about her return to Senegal from France and the reunion she would have between her and Maury and what that could have looked like. And how you had mentioned earlier, he found a story. It was a Swiss play called The Visit from 1956 by playwright Friedrich Dürrenmatt. And the characters are totally different from Touki Bouki, but it feels connected to that story because of it being about two lovers, long separated, coming back together. And in this story, it's about a wealthy woman named Linguère who returns to Colobane, which is actually the region of Senegal where Mambéty grew up. So she confronts her former lover, Draman, who had abandoned her when she was with his child and publicly humiliated her. The child dies, and Linguère leaves and faces much hardship, but over the years, she turns her situation around and becomes this woman of great power and wealth. So when she returns to Colobane, she makes an offer to the community: kill her former lover, and in return, she will bestow upon them a great deal of money. And it's interesting because at first the community resistance, like, they don't want blood on their hands. He's a cherished member of this community. But then as the movie progresses, the appeal of money and prosperity becomes more and more intoxicating. And it's just an interesting satire about one man's downfall and his penance for like a past mistake. Mambéty himself is actually in the movie, and he's fully in the movie. He plays this character named Ghana, who is like a prominent member of the community, and he's also sort of like a mediator, which I think is an interesting reference to Mambéty as a director too. And the title is interesting because hyenas are opportunists, like the animal. They both hunt and scavenge. And there's footage of hyenas throughout like sort of the end of the movie. And they are meant to represent like the members of the community who are tasked with this decision of whether to hunt the man down in order to scavenge the wealth from the wealthy woman. So I think that's a very strategic use of the term hyenas and that representation. So if you like Touki Bouki, that's a really interesting film to watch. And then the other sequel is actually a documentary. It's called A Thousand Suns, and it was released in 2013. And this is a documentary by Mady Diop, Mambéty's niece. In fact, her father, Wassis Diop, is Mambéty's brother and is in the film. And he is a well-known musician who's actually worked with his brother on other of his films. So A Thousand Suns starts off as a documentary. We see Magaye Niang, who played Maury in Touki Bouki. He's up to now. He's a farmer, and we see him herd cattle, and we see them at the abattoir. So it kind of echoes that those beginning scenes of Touki Bouki, like they're very evocative of that. In the film, he attends a screening of Touki Bouki, and he's asked about his participation in the film, and he's sort of riding on the coattails of the fame of him being in that film. And at one point of the film, he says, "Touki Bouki is my story." And this is where the documentary shifts, and it sort of becomes a documentary fiction hybrid, because Magaye Niang is seen talking to Anta on the phone, and he's following up with her. This is 40 years later, after she left on that boat to France. Now, Mareme Niang, who plays Anta in Touki Bouki, is not in the film, but the conversation with Anta kind of is biographical to her situation. She left the year after she made Touki Bouki, and then she eventually made her way to New York and then to Alaska. So in the phone conversation, we learned that Anta is now living in Alaska. She's working on an oil rig, and the rest of the movie has the man who played Maury transversing this frozen landscape, and it becomes like mystical and poetic. Mady Diop is a really interesting filmmaker, and I know you wanted to talk more about a couple of her other films too.
I did, yeah, and you've teed me up for that perfectly, almost as if we'd planned this. Yeah, no, she is, like you said, Mambéty's niece, a very interesting filmmaker, and I wanted to talk a little about her two feature films Atlantics from 2019 and Dahomey from 2024. So Atlantics was her debut feature film. She had earlier made a short film of the same title. The film is set in Dakar, like Touki Bouki. It deals with some similar themes, migration being an obvious example. Certainly a very different film. It involves a woman called Ada who is engaged to be married to a rich man. Although really she loves a construction worker called Suleiman. And Suleiman heads off to Europe. So again, the idea of emigrating, like in Touki Bouki, hoping for a better life. It's probably best actually if I don't say too much more about that film in terms of the storyline, except to say that it's a movie where supernatural goings on come into play. Mati Diop said, as the daughter of an immigrant, so she was born in Paris to a French mother and a Senegalese father. So she talked about migration being part of her history and her identity. She sees it as a very complex reality. She felt that her easiest choice in a way would have been to put herself forward as a French director, but that she wanted to make a statement by making her first film in Senegal. And she has spoken about her uncle's legacy, wanting to carry on that legacy. And you just get the sense that it was very important to her to make this movie. Really recommended. I haven't seen it actually since it came out, but it's a very striking film. I think people will agree if they see it. Her second feature film then that I mentioned is Dahomey from 2024. Going back to what you were saying about a tendency to blend documentary elements with fictional elements, and I think that's relevant here too. This film is about a number of royal artifacts that were taken from the Kingdom of Dahomey, which in the present day is Benin, taken from Dahomey to France during the colonial era. And now the film is about the present day, the contemporary return of a small number of these artifacts. And it's kind of examining the cultural value of these artifacts, some of the debate surrounding them. So we see scenes of things like the statues being packed up in art galleries. There's a memorable sequence where we see a discussion at a university. Students are talking about the idea of these artifacts being repatriated. And it's interesting because you get a range of different views. Some people think it's great that these items are coming back. Some think it's actually quite insulting that more haven't been returned. So an interesting level of complexity, I think, to the way the film deals with the subject matter. When I said that it has fictional elements, the main thing I'm thinking of is that one of the statues is given this voiceover where he's telling us about his time in storage, about his feelings, that he's afraid of not being recognized and so on. And there's something kind of natural about the way that approach emerged. So Mati Diop had an idea for a fictional film where a mask would be telling its story about being captured and taken into exile and then ultimately going home. She hadn't written the script for this film, but she was quite close to getting started. And then she reads about these royal artifacts that were due to be returned. And at that point, she said that she felt she had a duty to make the film. And like I said, she felt it's a film that reflects on there are different voices, and she definitely wanted that. And that's why you have a representation of the point of view of one of these objects. It's why you have this debate in the film, which is about what younger people think. So, yeah, two films I would highly recommend, Raquel. I think she's a very interesting filmmaker. Can't wait to see what she does next. I read an interview with her from May of 2025, but couldn't pick up a sense of what she was thinking of doing next. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see, right?
Yeah, and I hope she makes more because she is really interesting. I watched Dahomey recently for the first time. In fact, that's the reason why I got a movie subscription because I really wanted to watch this
Okay.
movie. And I was really taken with it. It's just really amazing. And I love how that beginning part of the movie is so quiet with how they're preparing the statues and the works of art and how they're bringing them over to Benin and how they're installing it. I think it's at the presidential palace and how they're installing them, and it's so quiet. It's so quiet. And then you get that fascinating debate with the university
Mm.
students that is so vocal. I mean, they're just volleying like lots of really interesting ideas and perspectives to each other. So you get like this really silent beginning, and then you get this sort of like boisterous but really engaging other part, and then you get that warped sound from the work of art that's speaking that fictional element. So like the sound is really interesting in that movie. I would highly recommend it. And I also have some more recommendations because that's what I do, but also I really love Senegalese cinema. I'm so excited for this episode because I really wanted to talk about more films from this country. So I wanted to talk about the films that I had mentioned earlier in the episode. The first is Pauline Sumanu Vieira's Africa on the Seine from 1955. Like I had mentioned earlier, that's considered the first Francophone film from Africa, and it's considered the first Senegalese film. It's a short documentary about a few university students from Senegal who are studying in France. It's an interesting snapshot, a bit romanticized of like expat life, but also it has shots of home too, so it kind of evokes the sense of homesickness for the homeland. And it's available to watch online. In the Internet Archive actually has it in multiple with subtitles in multiple languages, so it's very accessible. And the next films I wanted to recommend are by one of my favorite filmmakers is Ousmane Sembène. I talked about Black Girl from 1966 in the first episode of the season, but just to kind of give a recap, it's about a young woman from Dakar who works as a nanny for this white couple, and when that family moves back to the south of France, they take her with them. And when she's there, she's faced with like the drudgery of domesticity. Her job requirements pile up. The wife, her boss, is very controlling. The husband and his friends like sexualize her and humiliate her. It does a beautiful job in like tapping into those themes of like colonialism, class inequality, exploitation. And then Black Girl and Jean Dielman also just both deal with domesticity, and they both have very shocking ending. And then my favorite Ousmane Sembène film is Shala from 1975. It's this really interesting satire about a corrupt politician who is marrying a third wife, and he's unable to consummate the marriage. In fact, the term Shala is Wolof for like impotence. So after that happens, like his political career and his personal life spiral out of control. Title Shala has a double meaning. It's both the inability to consummate marriage, but it's also as a politician, he's corrupt and useless, so he's really unable to fulfill what he should be doing as a politician. And the film has this great subplot of this group of like disabled citizens who come together to enact revenge on him, and it has quite a shocking ending as well. It's just so interesting, and the film is so beautifully filmed. There's all these really wonderful shots of like the actors, but also extras. It's just so visually interesting, and the theme is really interesting, and it's actually like that ending is sort of satisfying. Definitely worth watching. And then the last film I'll talk about is Sedo from 1977, and that's a historical drama about a village whose traditions and cultures are being threatened by like organized religion. I really like the performance of Tabitha Ndiaye, who plays a princess who's at first kidnapped but then comes back into power. Just a friendly reminder, since we've mentioned a lot of films in this episode, that every film we discussed in this episode is on a dedicated list on our Letterboxd. So it's letterboxd.com/CineHistorians, and you can find dedicated lists to all of our episodes for both of our seasons.
Great. And I think actually the idea of spreading the word about great cinema leads me nicely onto what I wanted to talk about, which is something you alluded to earlier, which is Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Project and the work that involves. So Scorsese called, and this is a slight maybe hint for a future episode, because we will be talking about Martin Scorsese at some point in time down the line. He had called Touki Bouki a cinematic poem made with a raw, wild energy. And then you get this point in 2008 where the film is recirculated because it's been restored by Scorsese's World Cinema Project. And apparently, this new presentation it really highlighted the astonishing color palette of the movie. The World Cinema Project is part of Scorsese's broader film foundation. And according to the most recent information on their website, the World Cinema Project has restored, preserved, and exhibited 67 films from all over the world: Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, Central America, South America, and the Middle East. Apparently, it started to take shape when Scorsese had this idea that there was a need for an organization that really was dedicated to films from marginalized parts of the world cinematically, parts of the world where film culture sort of took a backseat to more urgent concerns. And he felt that these films needed not just to have a restoration or something like that. These films needed, championing, needed another shot at finding a wider audience, finding acclaim. I just think it's worth flagging up because I think there are lots of people who are like me and who consider Martin Scorsese to be, a true champion of cinema because, he's a very engaging speaker. His enthusiasm for film, for cinema as an art form is contagious. The last few years have been kind of interesting because there's been kind of a counter movement to that, which is people online who've tried to make him a bit of a cartoon villain at times, because there was this whole thing where he's spoken out about what he's called manufactured content and superhero movies and all that sort of thing. And that has led to an attempt to pigeonhole Scorsese as a kind of elitist gatekeeper. What I think he actually does is the opposite of gatekeeping, because he's trying to make films more accessible. You just need to have a bit of a sense of, willingness to try films from places that you're not too familiar with, or try movies you've never heard of. I don't think he's an elitist. I think he's somebody who's done as much as he possibly can to keep alive films of all kind from all over the world. And so, I just wanted to highlight the World Cinema Project's work on Touki Bouki because I think it's a great example of that. Which side of the fence are you on with Scorsese, Raquel? Do you see him more like I do, perhaps?
I think he's allowed to have his opinions. We might not always agree with him, but he's such a huge champion, not only for world cinema, but also for film history, classic film. He won the Robert Osborne Award for his efforts to promote and preserve film history. And, he's the reason why him and the World Cinema Project are the reason why I got to see Touki Bouki, and also the reason I got to see another African film called Zambizanga from Angola too. So there's the accessibility is so key for us to really appreciate these films from places that don't get as much exposure, but have just as good art. Like we see how Touki Bouki is such a interesting and dynamic film, and without that, maybe that restoration and that release on physical media, then we might not be able to appreciate it like we do.
Yeah, well, hopefully we've followed in some small way in Scorsese's footsteps with this episode by championing the film. I would like to think so. And I think actually that's a very natural point where we can start to say our goodbyes, Raquel. So it's been fantastic as ever to talk about this movie with you. And I'm very glad you recommended it. And also glad that you gave me a heads up about one or two of the things that I was letting myself in for. This one was your choice, like we've said. I think this was your third out of 4 choices for this season. So we're going to do your final choice next time out. And I cannot wait to revisit this film. So why don't you tell us what we're doing next?
This is one of my favorite films of all time. It's in my Letterboxd top 4. It is Celine Sciamma's Portrait of a Lady on Fire from 2019.
Cannot wait. Okay, great. So join us very soon for that one, listeners. As ever, just before we go, a quick reminder that if you're listening to us on something like Apple or Spotify or whatever, we would love you to rate and review our podcast. And we're not just saying that in kind of a selfish way, wanting the applause. It would help us. It would help us find new listeners. It would mean that our podcast finds its way to people who will find it enjoyable. So a quick 5-star, a 1-line review is all we need. If you can possibly take a minute or so to do that for us, we will be eternally grateful. And on YouTube, Raquel, it's the famous story, isn't it? Smash the button so you don't miss out on future episodes, right?
Yeah, you can smash that button or tap it gently, whatever you prefer. So you can subscribe to us on YouTube, youtube.com/CineHistorians. And like you said, hit that bell notification so you never miss an episode.
Great stuff. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us for this discussion about Touki Bouki. We'll be back very soon with Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And we'll see you next time. Bye now. You can find the CineHistorians at cinehistorians.com and on X, Letterboxd, and YouTube at CineHistorians.
If you're interested in supporting the show, please consider leaving us a Ko-fi. You can find our Ko-fi link and all of our other links in the show notes. Thank you for listening and happy viewing.